Auburn basketball has learned where it will play its SEC opponents in 2026 when it defends its SEC crown. Welcome back into the Barn Hoops podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Hillman. As we learned yesterday, where Auburn will play its 2026 opponents for the SEC schedule this upcoming season. Not too many surprises. There is one unexpected, maybe, difference from the past few years that we've been accustomed to. We'll get into that as we move along in this show. We're going to talk about how Auburn stacks up against the rest of the SEC as it defends its SEC title. But first, I want to remind you that this show is brought to you by mybookie.ag. You can receive a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 by using the coupon code BARN. That's BARN. Coupon code BARN at mybookie.ag earns you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 as you can move along in this summer for your gambling needs at mybookie.ag. But again, as I was saying, the Auburn Tigers, the 2024-25 SEC champions, have learned where that title defense will take place next year throughout the SEC season. We do not know when Auburn will play, against Alabama. We do not know when Auburn will play against Kentucky or Arkansas, but we will learn that, I think, probably in August. That would be my best guess. Hopefully, maybe a little bit earlier, but obviously we'll update that schedule as we learn. But for now, we know what the opponents are and where those games will take place. Now, to be quite frank with you, it's not much of a surprise. All of Auburn's home games this past season are flipped to road games. So Auburn against Florida, that was obviously a home game last season. Auburn will visit the defending national champions this upcoming season. But the one surprise that maybe wasn't expected, but there was an inkling about it, is that Auburn will not play Georgia twice in 2026. The home and away opponents for the Auburn Tigers in 2026 will be Alabama, Arkansas, and Ole Miss. I'll also present to you right here the graphic for that Auburn men's basketball released today, noting those opponents. You can read over it so that you can see everything. That's my biggest takeaway, is that Auburn will only play Georgia once. It'll be on the road next season, but it will play Arkansas twice. So John Calipari, in his second year at Arkansas with that roster that's finally cemented after some turmoil last season in the preseason, he has his roster ready, and Auburn will play the Razorbacks twice next year. Obviously, as I mentioned, Kentucky comes back to Neville Arena after Auburn went on the road, clinched the SEC title, and won its first game in Rupp Arena since 1988. Tigers will go for their second straight win over the Wildcats next year. Ole Miss is that home and away opponent as well. Obviously, Alabama is one that was a lock, but Ole Miss is the other permanent opponent. So that's kind of how the SEC schedule works. Auburn and every SEC team has two permanent home and away opponents and then one rotating home and away opponent. Auburn's permanent SEC home and away opponents are Alabama and, as it appears so, Ole Miss, since Auburn has played Ole Miss home and away for the past decades since Missouri and Texas A&M joined the conference. So Georgia falls off the home schedule, and the Tigers will go on the road to Athens. But Ole Miss, obviously, a great opponent with Chris Beard at the helm. He's getting his roster cemented just like John Calipari at Arkansas as we move along. But again, that schedule is available at auburntigers.com as well as the Auburn men's basketball social media accounts. Or it's not really a schedule. That's it's kind of funny to say that. We know the opponents. We know exactly where Auburn will play. We just don't know when. And that's why it's going to be a little bit tricky to start to project and gauge the temperature of how Auburn could finish in the SEC, besides the fact that Auburn has a brand new basketball team other than Tahaad Pettiford. But with the opponents being there are schedule losses when you have to play back-to-back road games, or like last year, Auburn took the SEC crown at Kentucky and immediately had to turn around and go to College Station and face Texas A&M without its starting point guard in Denver Jones. If you put that game in a different spot on the schedule, I like to think that Auburn wins that game against the Aggies. But that's just part of it. So again, we'll be able to project a little bit more whenever we get to that scheduling portion in August from the SEC. But, can the Tigers repeat? Absolutely. The ceiling and the floor are a little bit different than last year's team, obviously, with it being a brand new team. I think that this Auburn team ceiling is as high as last season's team. The floor is probably a little bit lower, though, because of all the new pieces. These guys have got to gel together, and they've got to have things figured out by the time January 1st rolls around, and those first SEC games will be played. And probably even a little bit before that, if you want to have a high seed in the NCAA tournament, the reason Auburn had the number 1 overall seed in the 2025 NCAA tournament was because of its stout non-conference schedule and how it performed against that schedule, with the lone loss coming at Duke in Cameron Indoor Stadium, and it was a close game as well. So obviously, Auburn has all the, wants to accomplish everything next year, but this is a case-by-case basis where you look throughout the SEC, and it's a similar story everywhere else. And most of these teams are having to rebuild its rosters and really reload them so that they're ready for this upcoming season, because there was a lot of talent lost over this past season. Obviously, Auburn lost its SEC player, National Player of the Year in Janai Broome, as well as plenty of other contributors that really helped Auburn make that Final Four run, leadership roles like Dylan Cardwell and Chris Moore. So there's other teams in that same boat, and that's why I think that Auburn is one of the contenders in the SEC. And as you look through the rest of the opponents, and obviously I think the key here when you're looking at the rest of the SEC is the home and away opponents, and who these teams are going to have to go to on the road. Road games are never a given in conference play in college basketball, and Auburn was really good on the road last season, quite frankly. Only lost that one game at Texas A&M, but was really, really good other than that. So I think the standout to me is the defending national champions in Florida, and that home schedule for the Gators is quite fortunate. It's just how it plays out. Again, there's nothing groundbreaking about where these teams are playing. It's just last year's home schedule flipped to the road, and maybe a few tweaks here because of the home and away opponents. So Florida at home will get Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, LSU, Mississippi State, Tennessee, as well as the 3 home and away opponents. That's Georgia, Kentucky, and South Carolina. So if you look at Florida's schedule, its toughest opponent on the road is Kentucky, with Ole Miss behind that. And then past that, there's not really a standout team from the past season. That's obviously not to say none of these teams can step it up and figure things out for the 2025 to 26 campaign. But if you look at last season and you're basing it off that, Florida really has 2 difficult road opponents versus someone like Auburn, who has to go to the defending national champions in Florida, as well as Tennessee and Alabama and Ole Miss and Arkansas. Those are 5 really, really tough road games, and not a single one of those are going to be a given. And, that's just sometimes the luck of the draw, and that's how schedules work, and especially in conference. But I do think that you're looking at Auburn, you're looking at Florida, you're looking at Alabama, you're looking at Kentucky, you're looking at Tennessee as some of your key contenders in the SEC. Ole Miss, Georgia are 2 teams that have been on the sleeper side, as well as Mississippi State, but they obviously have not made that next jump to be a top 4 contender in the SEC. Arkansas obviously had it's figuring things out with John Calipari, but again, I think Auburn is right there at the cream of the crop with the contenders of the SEC, especially because several teams are in the same boat as Auburn with new rosters and plenty of transfers. Freshmen are going to have to make moves. But, I do think that the fact that Auburn is getting the permanent opponents of Alabama and Ole Miss, I think the SEC thinks highly of Chris Beard and Ole Miss and that program as it stands. So that's something to be said for Auburn. Obviously, you're going to have some of the automatic, teams that are playing home and away, like Alabama and Tennessee. That's one that's really you have to do, because Alabama and Tennessee are such big rivals on the court, on the football field, and so on. So I think it's a big deal for Auburn to get Arkansas twice as well. John Calipari always draws ratings, so that means the SEC feels like Auburn and Arkansas is going to be a big ratings draw for TV purposes and everything that goes into that. Versus Georgia that hasn't really lived up to its billing over the last decade or so, and Mike White's getting that program on the right track, but it's not there quite yet, and obviously it could survive everyone, but. Again, the teams to beat in 2026, I mentioned a few programs and several of them in the same boat as Auburn. We'll start with the two permanent opponents or not the permanent opponents, but two of the teams that Auburn will play home and away. Alabama is going to look quite a bit different than it did last year with LeBaron Philon, Latrell Wrightsell, and Aiden Holloway being some of the key returners for the Crimson Tide, and then Aiden Sherrill at the center position. But the Tide adds Jalil Bethea and Taylor Balbowen. That's probably the starting five right there. Philon, Wrightsell, Bethea, Balbowen, and Sherrill. That might be a little bit of a different Alabama team. I think that Alabama might slow it down a little bit and play more like Auburn did this past season. And Auburn's probably going to speed it up quite a bit this season with Tahaad Pettiford leading the charge and being the dynamic playmaker that he is. You look at Arkansas, it's got its core together still with DJ Wagner, Carter Knox, and Trayvon Brazile. Three guys that really, really helped Arkansas to that big run in the NCAA tournament, taking down St. John's and just having a great tournament run in John Calipari's first season as head coach. As I mentioned, Florida doesn't have Walter Clayton. I think that is a big, big piece that Florida loses. I'll be very intrigued to see how the Gators try and replicate that scoring production. They bring in Xavion Lee as well as Boogie Fland at the guard positions, but still have Thomas Howell, Alex Condon, and Ruben Chinyulu, who were obviously the core front court players for Florida. That's just not those are not the three guys that Florida ran its offense through. Obviously, they were studs on the defensive end, and these guys had their moments offensively, but it was the Walter Clayton show throughout the NCAA tournament, throughout the month of March for Florida. So I'll be really interested to see how Boogie Fland and Xavion Lee pan out for Todd Golden and the Gators. And again, I think it's going to be easier to project whenever we see what the schedule looks like. As we get into that, does Auburn play Alabama in the last game of the season? Quite frankly, I hope that's the case. I think that just builds so much more hype around the matchup than there already is. And not that it needs that much more hype with it being Auburn and Alabama. I hope both of the games are on Saturday. It had been almost a decade since Auburn played at Alabama on a Saturday until this past season when that 1-2. Imagine that 1 versus 2 matchup had been on a Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Yeah, it's a 1 versus 2 matchup. That doesn't take it. You can't take away from that at all. But it just felt that much bigger on a Saturday in the afternoon like it was this past season. And same with the game inside Neville Arena as well. Looking at the Kentucky Wildcats, coached by Mark Pope, this is a team that returns Otega Owe. He is the stud for this team and really can carry the Wildcats to probably an SEC championship. And that's the team that I'm looking out for in 2025 to 26 to really contend for that title alongside the Tigers, the Crimson Tide, and the Florida Gators. And then obviously the other team that Auburn plays twice in the SEC slate, home and away, the Ole Miss Rebels. This team's going to look a little bit different as well with A.J. Storr coming in from Kansas, but still returns Malik Dia, who was a great center for the Rebels last season. They lose Sean Padula, so that's a big score that the Ole Miss Rebels will have to replicate. But again, this is a roster that's big, and it has quite a bit of depth that Chris Beard has built into it. And if you look at it, it's almost 3 deep all the way across the board, and that's kind of hard to believe in this day and age, but that's the case for the Ole Miss Rebels, and I expect the Rebels to kind of try and make that leap past the middle of the pack of the SEC and contend for a top 4 seed in the SEC tournament. So again, Auburn will defend its SEC championship against these opponents next year at home and on the road. I really do think that this is a great home schedule for you fans, for all of us fans, to witness inside Neville Arena. There's a few road trips that are intriguing as well. I think it's great that Auburn gets Ole Miss home and away every single year. That I think that up there the Pavilion in Oxford is a great spot to watch a basketball game, and it's a great road trip for any fan to make. Hopefully that's a Saturday game, and there's plenty of orange and blue in the stands for that one. But again, I think that home slate, specifically with Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Ole Miss, really stands out for the Tigers, and we'll put them in prime position for some prime TV slots, as well as just really exciting games for the Tiger faithful, as well as any of those fans that make the trip down to the Plains. But again, if you look at it, and it's like I said, it's difficult to put a record out there for how the Tigers are going to do until I see when these games are going to be played, just because of schedule losses and whatnot. What I do think is it's going to take another 14-4, 15-3 campaign to defend as the SEC champions. I don't think that the SEC is going to be as much of a gauntlet next year where teams are eating each other alive. I think it'd be tough for Auburn to clinch, or anyone in the SEC to clinch the title with a week to play like the Tigers did this past season inside Rupp Arena. I think that this is going to come down to the wire. I think this is going to come down to the last week of the season. It's going to put a lot more pressure on those last couple of games of the SEC season, where you're playing with scenarios. All right, if this team wins this game, how does this impact this tiebreaker or whatnot? I think that's going to be the case this year. I don't think there's going to be a ton of separation between teams. But again, I would imagine many were saying the same about Auburn this past season. Obviously, I think the floor was much higher for the Tigers going into the 2024-25 campaign, and everyone expected the Tigers to compete for the SEC title. But I don't think anyone in their right mind expected Auburn to have it clinched at Rupp Arena the way they did this past season. So again, the SEC released its opponents and not the dates, but the locations for those games this upcoming season. Auburn loses Georgia off the permanent home and away rotation, keeps Alabama and Ole Miss. Arkansas is the rotational opponent this year, so Tigers will visit Bud Walton Arena for the first time since it set a record, since it had the largest win by an opponent in Bud Walton history when it defeated the Razorbacks, I think by 33 points back in 2024. That was an incredible game for the Tigers and really sparked that SEC season. It wasn't a championship until the SEC tournament, but it really set Auburn up for success in that season. So again, I think that you're going to get a lot more out of the actual schedule when these games are going to be played. But right now we can look at it and say, okay, 14-4 might not win the league this year. And it might, but it might be a shared championship if you're 14-4 and win the SEC title. I think 15-3 is going to be what wins it. And again, I think it's going to come down to the wire. I think that some of these teams like Florida and Alabama, as well as Kentucky, maybe in Arkansas, as well as Tennessee, can be right there. Texas A&M is a team that's been right there in the past, but it's got a first-year head coach, Bucky McMillan. The Aggies are new look this year, quite frankly. Obviously, Buzz Williams went up to Maryland, and now Bucky McMillan takes over. There's some familiar names that are joining Texas A&M with Jakari Lane, Pop Isaacs, Rylan Griffin, Federico. But and that's going to be the storylines in the SEC is these new look rosters, whether it's Auburn, whether it's Texas A&M, whether it's Alabama, and to an extent Florida without Walter Clayton. That's what we're going to see a lot of is, all right, how do these rosters work together? We're going to get a preview of that in the non-conference slates in November and December. And specifically Auburn will be tested, as well as several other teams, because it's great to see some of these schedules start to shake out for the non-conference slate, how tough these teams are starting to schedule. You look at December 6th, this is the day of the SEC football championship. This is when Auburn visits Arizona. There are so many great games that day. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I do think that it's one of those days where you realize, man, this is usually something that's saved for February or even March, but we're getting it on December 6th, a great day of college basketball. And that's going to be the case all December, even parts of November as well. And I just think that it sets up even better for the conference slates, that these teams are testing themselves. They're willing to do it. and it just provides more elite basketball to be put on display, whether it's in the SEC or in a different conference. So again, SEC opponents and locations release. We don't know when these games will be played. That should be released around August by the Southeastern Conference. As you know, I assume it wants to dig a little bit, figure out what these rosters look like and how they're going to fare in the SEC, so it can place some of those Saturday primetime games in the best spots as well as the Tuesday, Wednesday games. So again, thank you for tuning in to the Barn Hoops podcast. Make sure you tuned in for all of the Barn Auburn's podcast network. The offseason is off and running with Auburn football, and they've got you covered all over it with Village Vice, with Zach Blackerby and Brad Law, as well as the Top Button podcast with Kyle Rush, aka Charlie 5. They've got you covered for all the summer doings, and it's talking season. That's what this is all about. It's going to be a great offseason for the Barn Auburn Network. So hope you're staying tuned in. We'll talk to you next time on the Barn Hoops podcast.